Hello, good afternoon. Today our guest is Professor Jon Davidann. Hello, John. How are you doing?
I'm doing well, Lipton. Thanks for inviting me on the show.
Yes, and Dr. Jon Davidann is a professor of history and chair of the History, Humanities, and International Studies Department at Hawaii Pacific University. You're an expert, John. You know a lot about the history of Japan.
Yeah, my specialty is U.S. East Asian relations, and I've written a lot on this and really enjoyed it. I feel, quite a privilege to do the kind of work that I do. So yeah, I'm very grateful. Thanks.
And John, I don't know about you, but even when I was a student in high school, I was interested in Fukuzawa Yukichi and the Meiji Restoration.
Yeah. Yes.
Yes.
Well, Fukuzawa is a very interesting guy. So that's cool that you got to learn about him in high school and kind of experience some of the ways that he thought about the world at that time. Of course, this is the late 19th century. This is, when Fukuzawa reaches his intellectual maturity, it's the 1870s. And Japan has just been through this cataclysmic event called the Meiji Restoration. So, but if we could back up, we can talk about Fukuzawa and the atmosphere in which he grew up. I think that's fairly important to understanding Fukuzawa. So Fukuzawa was born and raised in Osaka. He was kind of middle of the road samurai, not elite samurai, not lower samurai. His father was an accountant for the local lord in Osaka. And significantly, although his father died shortly after Fukuzawa was born, Fukuzawa heard these stories from family members that his father actually wanted to be an intellectual and had gone to the Lord and said, hey, I'd like to go to school. I'd like to study, because there were schools in Osaka where you could go and learn. And his Lord said, forget about it. No, you are an accountant and you'll always be an accountant. So this was disheartening, of course, to Fukuzawa's father, and it just enraged Fukuzawa as a young man to have heard this story and then to feel the kind of a prison-like rank order system that the old Tokugawa regime in Japan exerted on the retainers, on its samurai. So I think that's important information about Fukuzawa. The other thing that's important about Fukuzawa's growing up is that he did have education, unlike his father. In the school he went to, his teachers made fun of Chinese learning. That's significant because the main school of thought in Japan was the old Chushi type Confucianism, where you cultivate yourself, learn fine poetry, you dress properly, and it was really this kind of internal virtues that Confucianism encouraged. And Fukuzawa didn't have any time for this. He saw a Japan that was in the midst of dramatic changes, and he wanted to be a part of those changes. And he thought this type of Confucianism was all wrong. So that's Fukuzawa growing up. We can move on, or you can ask another question about Fukuzawa if you like.
Yeah, yes, I'm actually planning to ask more questions about Fukuzawa Yukichi. So yeah, you were talking about his intellectual maturity. What were some of the ideas posited by Fukuzawa Yukichi that proved to be influential?
Right. So Fukuzawa, as a young man, learns English. This is very important, because then he's chosen as an interpreter on a diplomatic mission to the United States in the early 1860s. And then he goes on two more of these missions. He learns about the West. He even writes some simple books about Western culture and Western ideas that are published back in Japan. And voila, he starts to have a publishing career. He writes two very important books, one on learning and education in the early 1870s, and the second one on civilization in the late 1870s. Both books become the most important books the most important ways of thinking about Japan in the 1870s. So it becomes quite influential. And in addition to publishing books, he founds a university, Keio University today in Japan. It's top 5 in the country. That was founded by Fukuzawa. He founds a newspaper. He's what we would call a public intellectual. So he's a very smart guy. He's an intellectual. He's writing all of these ideas, but he's also engaging with the public, engaging with the Japanese nation. So some of the things that were important to Fukuzawa, the first, maybe the central feature of Fukuzawa's thought is that he believed that Japanese needed to be more independent in the way that they thought and they acted. And this is directly related to his father's experience with the Tokugawa. Fukuzawa believed the old system, the old Tokugawa system, just imprisoned people, locked people into their rank, and it made it impossible for people to have differing views and to kind of open their minds to outside ideas. And he thought this was just terrible. So one of the things Fukuzawa wanted was for people to really leave that old regime behind and to actually engage in ideas and have their own thoughts. He believed that if Japan could create a nation of independent thinkers who are not, worried about a loyalty system or what the guy ahead of him thinks, that they could create a strong nation, an independent nation. And that was kind of his goal, because of course, we're in a time period in the 1870s when the Western powers have intruded into China in a major way. They have spheres of influence all over the east coast of China. And then they've also entered Japan. In the 1850s, they opened up Japan forcibly to trade. And by the 1870s, the Japanese have signed unequal treaties with the West. And there's concern among some people that, if the Japanese slip up, that the British might send warships that they have in their harbor in Hong Kong and send them in and take over Japan. So there's this concern. So that the concept of independence is very important, because for the Japanese and for people like Fukuzawa, it's tangible, it's palpable. There's either the independence that they can attain by fighting for their nation, or there's colonialism, which could put them in a very bad strait. So yeah, that's kind of the central feature of Fukuzawa. There's a lot more, but we can start with that.
I remember reading Alan McFarlane's book, and in the book, he argues that Fukuzawa Yukichi admired Westerners because they enjoyed debating. And Fukuzawa Yukichi was arguing that the Japanese were big conformists and they didn't encourage debate.
Exactly. This is part of that old Tokugawa system where very few people held all of the political power, and the commoner, the average Japanese subject either was not educated at all, or if educated, poorly educated, and didn't really have a chance to. It would have been quite dangerous to debate certain political ideas in that time. Now, having said that, Japanese elites, Japanese samurai during the Tokugawa period did debate ideas. They founded schools. There was a school of Dutch learning. Schools devoted to Western ideas and Western learning. There was this school devoted to Neo-Confucianism, the Wang Yang Ming thought of Neo-Confucianism. So there were all these schools in Japan, but it was elites. The samurai comprised about 5% of the Japanese population in the Tokugawa period. And therefore, it's just the very top of society that has the ability to debate. The rest of Japanese have to fall in line, otherwise they could get into big trouble.
Professor Jon, some years ago, I was introduced to an article, and in the academic community, it is widely argued that the article was published by Fukuzawa Yukichi on leaving Asia. Is this true? Did he actually write it?
Yeah. So yeah, he did write this. It's an essay that he published in his own newspaper. So we're pretty confident that he wrote it. It's like an editorial, it was just a few thoughts on what was happening in the rest of East Asia. This is also very important. So Fukuzawa was quite concerned even before he wrote that essay. He wrote the essay, I believe, in 1885, but even before that, he was quite concerned about Western dominance in East Asia, and he wanted other East Asian nations like China and Korea to assert more independence and to move forward with, get rid of these decrepit forms of government, pardon me, and move forward with newer ideas, with Republican forms of government. So Fukuzawa actually funds and supports some Korean independence advocates in the early 1880s. He actually brings them to Japan. They spend a little time at his school, and then they go back to Japan, to Korea. He funds their activities monetarily. And then he also sends one of his his publicists over to Korea to help them in writing leaflets and pamphlets advocating their views. Now, they were anti-monarchist. They wanted a republic in Korea. And so Fukuzawa was pushing for this. And then these individuals actually engage in a rebellion in 1884. And they both are killed in the rebellion. And so this is a bad thing. I mean, Fukuzawa wants to take the rest of East Asia and begin to modernize it like Japan as independent nations, independent thinkers. Well, it's not working very well. And so, and he's disillusioned by the fact, he put some resources into this Korea project. So in 1885, a year after this rebellion, then he writes this essay. And in the essay, he argues that Westernization is like a disease, that it will overspread Asia no matter what. And so he's very concerned about Westernization and the impact of the power of the West. And it's not, so this particular essay has been misinterpreted as a call to Japan to Westernize. It is not, in fact, a call to Westernize. It's a call to wake up and say, hey, the West is coming. We need to get ready. We need to prepare ourselves and become as independent and as strong as possible. And so Fukuzawa, in his late years, now this is the late 1880s, becomes a proponent of Japanese empire for this very reason, because he believes that, well, he saw the failure in Korea, he's seeing the failures in China. He believes that there's no other option but the Japanese to lead East Asia into modernity. He doesn't like the Western powers. He doesn't like the influence they exerted on the continent of East Asia. So that's the context for that essay. It's like I say, there's been a lot of interpretation that I think has led people down the wrong path. But a lot of that has happened post-World War II as well, when of course the United States occupies Japan. It exerts a tremendous amount of influence over Japan. And then what happens is that idea of influence gets exaggerated, projected backwards into the late 19th century, when the United States really didn't have that much influence at all over Japan.
And in your article published in the magazine Aeon, you reference Harold Quigley, and you write, among these, the political scientist Harold Quigley was skeptical of Japan's Western credentials. Writing the article, Feudalism Reappears in Japan, and this was published in 1936 in the Christian Science Monitor magazine.
Yeah, that's correct. And so Harold Quigley was a political scientist from my home state, Minnesota, and he was a bright guy. He knew quite a bit about Japan. He had written about Japan before, but really had this kind of superficial understanding of what was going on in Japan, and saw the rise of Japanese militarism, connected that rise of Japanese militarism to the previous regimes in Japan, the feudal, the Tokugawa, the regime that Fukuzawa had grown up in, the Tokugawa of the 19th century, and said, oh, the Japanese are returning to the past. They're not modern at all. They're actually, this feudal militarist regime, which has no place in the modern world. So yeah, and that becomes, by the late 1930s, that becomes a very common way to think about Japan in the West, and especially in the United States.
But in your article, you also listed the antithesis of Harold Quigley, a distinguished professor who wrote the book, The United States and Japan.
Right. So yeah. So the argument against Quigley then is that the problem here is that, and this goes back to so I published a book called The Limits of Westernization back in 2019. The essay that you're referring to, the Eon essay, was based upon the book. And so here's why I wrote the book. Okay, it is kind of interesting to see. So what happened is, in a previous book I had written on U.S.-Japanese cultural diplomacy, I had noticed that what was happening in Japan did not match up with how Western commentators were talking about Japan in the 1920s, but especially in the 1930s. And essentially what had happened is Americans and Westerners had been making an intellectual mistake. They had been conflating Westernization with modernization and saying, those two things are the same thing. And therefore, if the Japanese don't Westernize according to our model, then they are not in fact modern, and they don't belong in the modern world, and they're a very dangerous kind of rogue nation and rogue empire. So this is the framework in which Quigley is writing. It's the framework in which he has conflated Westernization and modernization, and that's a mistake. And we've seen this in many non-Western nations, that non-Western nations can actually modernize without doing everything the West did. They can modernize with models, sometimes models that are not Western at all. Actually, Japan becomes one of those non-Western models for other nations to modernize outside of kind of predominant Western influence or Western domination. So against that, what you find in Japan in the early 20th century is a nation that's quite modern. Fukuzawa is an example. Other intellectuals are an example. The Japanese have a huge reading public in the early 1900s, over 90% literacy. They have 7 daily newspapers in Tokyo. This is by any definition that we have in the West a modern nation. And yet we cannot recognize it as such because we have assumed that in order to be modern, you have to be Western. And Japan does not Westernize on the basis of the United States or Europe. So that's the mistake that Harold Quigley is making. Now, when I was writing the previous book, I recognized, wait a minute, there's an intellectual problem there with this. And therefore, that's what I dove into. I cut into that error. And that's why I wrote this book called The Limits of Westernization. It's really based upon that one intellectual conflation or mistake. So, and this is a mistake that some Americans even today make, assuming that Japan is kind of a carbon copy of the West. That's why they've become so successful in the 20th century, because they copied the West, and not really understanding the Japanese context very well at all, or the origins of Japanese modernity in Fukuzawa's thought, in the thought of other Japanese intellectuals in the late 19th and the early 20th century.
I have a term to describe Japan, which is not really my idea. I am borrowing it from Orlando Patterson. So in one of his papers comparing Jamaica to Barbados, Orlando Patterson notes that the Bajans were not passive. They actually engage in ruthless cultural appropriation. Maybe I could be getting it wrong, but his idea is that Blacks in Barbados modernized to become wealthy, to become wealthy in order to avert future embarrassment. So the Japanese did not want to end up like the Chinese. For centuries, the Japanese were trading with the Chinese, and they also kept tabs on the Dutch. And this is why it was easier for the Japanese to modernize. Some people usually say that during the Tokugawa period, Japan was a closed nation. This is not really true. The Japanese were keeping tabs on the Dutch. And when the Japanese recognized that the West was really powerful, they said, hey, we cannot afford to end up like China. And this was a major impetus that led to modernization.
Yes, yes, I think, I know and respect Orlando Patterson's work, and yeah, so there are other models. There are other models of the way of kind of what I've referred to as selective adaptation or selective modernization, or a selective appropriation. It's so it's actually, I think, fairly common in the modern world. We just haven't recognized it very much because we assume that the modern world is a product of the West. It's a product of certain processes that started in the West, the Industrial Revolution, the Scientific Revolution, the kind of the rise of intellectual discourse, the rise of academia, these kinds of things. And some of these things, yes, it's quite true, but some of these things were quite easily appropriated. I mean, the Japanese appropriated the British Industrial Revolution within a matter of a decade with their textiles manufacturing. So we've assumed that modernity is this kind of monolithic thing that cannot be torn apart. And I think that's another intellectual mistake. What I found when I wrote the book and when I studied the Japanese over these last 3 decades is that there's actually ways of being modern in one sense and not modern in another sense. There are different kinds of modernity, and there are ways in which you can draw the past into modernity, into the modern, and use that past in ways that are sometimes productive or other times actually a little bit dangerous. But modernity is simply not the monolith that we've assumed it to be. And I think there's all kinds of examples one can find. I think, you can find examples in the Caribbean. So that's very good.
We can even find examples today. The great United States of America is not afraid to engage in benchmarking. The fear of embarrassment creates the impetus to modernize and adopt superior foreign practices. The Germans and the French appropriated British technology. Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew, he went to several countries when he wanted to modernize, including Japan, England, America, etc.
Yes.
And this is why the Japanese are so admirable. Modernization and the limits of Westernization. Japan adopted Western scientific institutions and legal institutions, but they still managed to preserve the ancient culture of Japan. And this is quite surprising.
Right. Well, culture is a different term. I think culture happens and changes all the time, so it's a problematic term. But what the Japanese did is they brought their own traditions into their modernization. They culled ideas from the West. They culled ideas from Confucianism. One of the major, really the dominant form of ideology in the Japanese Empire in the early 20th century is actually based on a neo-Confucianist named Wang Yangming, who was a Chinese intellectual, diplomat, scholar, bureaucrat, and in fact, general in the early 16th century. So he's an interesting character in and of himself, but the Japanese are quite interested in Wang Yangming because he says that it's the sanctity of the nation is such that you can violate your oath to your family to maintain your patriotism to the nation. This becomes very important to the Japanese in the late 19th century in a time period in which patriotism means the difference between survival and Western imperialism. And therefore, some Japanese are actually doing this. They're actually choosing the nation over their own families. And this is kind of it's a shocking thing if you think of the traditions of Confucianism, where the family is number one and the state follows the model of the hierarchy of the family. To choose the nation over the family, that's quite an innovation. And the Japanese embrace this as a part of their ideology. It informs the imperial rescript on education. It informs their thinking about the nation in the late 19th century. So it's quite influential, and it's East Asian. It's not Western at all. It actually has deep roots within the Chinese civilization.
Yes, brilliant. But Fukuzawa Yukichi is also a bit controversial. Some credit Fukuzawa Yukichi with the rise of imperialism. Is this so? Is this so?
With Japanese imperialism.
Yes,
Yes, I mean,
Japanese.
right. So yeah, back to that question. So so when he wrote the essay on leaving Asia, it was with the thought that the Japanese really needed to be more involved in East Asia, and in the late 1880s, then he does in fact endorse more Japanese involvement in Korea and in China. And he dies, of course, before the Japanese make their major moves. 1894, 1895, the first Sino-Japanese War. And then, of course, the Russo-Japanese War, 1904, 1905, after which they've developed a major Northeast Asian empire. And so, but yes, he's interested. So you can argue Fukuzawa then was kind of an imperialist, or maybe a real imperialist. But what you can say about Fukuzawa is that do motives matter? I think in some ways motives matter. So what you can say about him is that he believed that Japan should be the leader of East Asia rather than the European powers. So he wanted to displace European and Western influence in East Asia, and then put Japan in that place, and believe that Japan could bring these places like China and Korea, bring them a more orderly governance, intellectual frameworks, universities like he built in Japan, newspapers, and then modernity and an independent, maybe Republican, maybe under a monarch like Japan, but an independent form of government that could kind of bring these nations into development.
Well, John, Fukuzawa Yukichi is extremely important to me because unlike you, John, I am from Jamaica, and Jamaica is a developing country. Singapore and Botswana during the 60s were laggards compared to Jamaica. Today, Jamaica is an economic basket case because of the IMF reform that started in 2007. The economy has improved. One of our finance ministers was praised by the international community, but it is still a basket case when compared to even countries that are highly corrupt like Nigeria. So yeah. Before I started this YouTube channel, I was somewhat of a business analyst and lobbyist for pro-technology policies in Jamaica. So I would meet with some people in the private sector, and frequently I wrote articles making suggestions. And these suggestions, obviously, I think that they make great sense because, like you, I'm a data-driven guy. But Jamaica, Professor John, and you could disagree, I live in the country and I've done a lot of research, Jamaica as a state is yet to attain what we call in sociology the post-conventional stage of development. People still believe in witchcraft and magic. I have several examples of even educated people, they feel ill and they go to a witch doctor. So when you criticize these practices, you are seen as backward and Eurocentric. So this is why I like Fukuzawa Yukichi, because Fukuzawa Yukichi preserved the culture of Japan, but he also appropriated some Western policies. And look at Japan today, a leader in technology. So Fukuzawa Yukichi is very important.
Yeah, I think, once again, I'll say this about the whole process of modernity and development is that we have tried to impose it as a one-size-fits-all, as a linear process, and a process at which endpoint then there is no more pre-modern, there's only modern. And I think all of that's a mistake. I don't think any of that's true. It does not proceed in a linear fashion. there's lots of different influences. It's not monolithic. And the pre-modern, or kind of traditions, can actually coincide with modern development, either successfully or unsuccessfully, in various ways. I see it in the United States, in truth. And so I think part of it is being able to understand that there doesn't have to be a wholesale adoption of Western ideas
Not at all.
or the conventions that we assume to be modern in order to be successful, or in order for modernity to go forward, in order for development to go forward. Japan has still, even today, has a lot of characteristics that you would associate with pre-modern
Yes.
nations. I mean, it has its business model is monopolistic. It has, in the past, at least, they've tried to fix this, but I'm not even sure it's fixed. High levels of corruption and kind of elite exchanges, which have benefited them, but have very few benefits for the common person in Japan. So the Japanese have made it work. I think they've made it work because they've made the nation cohere. I wouldn't call it culture so much as I would call it a sense of nationalism. This is what Fukuzawa wanted: a sense of nationalism, a sense that they're still in this project of nation building together. Now that has diminished as well in Japan. There's definitely, you can see signs of that as well, but still they're at a much higher level of that than I would say many Western nations, including the United States, in which American nationalism probably peaked in the early post-war period and has been declining ever since. And now you can see it in our political culture, which is so divisive, and people don't even really know what patriotism means anymore. But at any rate, I think this has been very important for Japan to keep people will have each other's backs in a way that simply doesn't exist in the West. Maybe the best example is the tsunami and the aftermath in Japan, the 2011 tsunami. And people just came out of the streets and out of other towns to help in the recovery. And it was just amazing to me to watch the Japanese work for the benefit of others. And I don't think that would happen in the United States or in other nations like that.
Well, don't underestimate the ability of Americans to be philanthropic. America is still the leader in civil society. And I say this because it is institutionally rich. There are just so many research organizations and foundations. So Tocqueville is actually correct, and his ideas are still relevant today. I admire the American spirit of entrepreneurship. Social capital in America is not dead. It isn't.
No, it's true. But I do think there's been a decline in. So we're talking about two different things: social capital and a sense of national coherence. I agree. I think it's declined, but we still have an enormous capacity in our nonprofit sector, in our profit, Americans still love to start businesses, and so entrepreneurship is still very powerful in this country. So, I mean, I'm not trying to paint it in black and white terms, because of course the United States is, still the leading economy in the world, and still has a lot to offer itself and the rest of the world in terms of its kind of the public sector. Yeah, it's an interesting debate. I mean, I hope we can kind of get things headed back in the right direction.
Yes. My problem with America today is that it is becoming quite unserious on a political level. Trump is not the only person who has a tweeting problem. In America, even mundane stories become a national issue. And that's a problem. Every other writer saying, prepare for the next civil war. I really don't like that type of discourse.
Yeah, I was just on another panel recently where, one of the political scientists said, oh, we're headed for a civil war. And it's like, I don't see any evidence of that. I'm teaching the Civil War right now in one of my classes at my university, and I don't see that we're even close to actually having a civil war. I do think that uh, we've declined in our ability to educate, to do civics education, basic civics education. What's the proper role of the citizen? How should citizens interact with each other in constructive ways? This kind of thing. We just don't do as good of a job as we used to. But
and John, before we wrap up, one question.
Right.
Briefly explain the Meiji Restoration. Just do so briefly, and then I'm going to make a point.
Briefly explain the Meiji Restoration.
Yes.
Yeah. So, okay, this is hard to do briefly, but so the Meiji Restoration was when the Tokugawa regime was overthrown by an alliance between the Satsuma clan, the Choshu clan, and then the emperor himself. They combined together, marched on Tokyo, which was the headquarters of the Tokugawa, and then they, in a very short war, they overthrew the Tokugawa. The Meiji Restoration inaugurates 2 decades of dramatic change in Japan. That's why I said this could be its own discussion, because historians still debate the nature of it, and the legacy of it is very powerful. I call and are very beneficial for the nation. They build the nation that becomes so powerful as an empire.
Who built the nation? John, you are breaking up for a bit. Who built the nation?
Yeah.
Who?
Yeah, so they built the nation, they built the building blocks of the nation, which became a powerful empire in leading up to World War II. And that same kind of the same models and the same practices you could see in the post-World War II period.
Which group built the nation? Which group built the nation? Because you are breaking up for a minute.
Oh, so as I was saying, it was the Satsuma and the Choshu. These are 2 different clans from the south of Japan, and then they added the emperor, and they defeated the Tokugawa in battle, and then they ruled Japan. The combination of them and a few others ruled Japan basically free hand for about 10 years until the Constitution was put into place.
All right.
But yeah, so yeah.
I just wanted to get that clear. So my point is not directly related to the Meiji Restoration. I'm going to comment on civic culture and why it's so bad. So I'm assuming, John, that you do several interviews. I like Brian Lamb, I like C-SPAN, and I like Peter Robinson of the Hoover Institution. But these days when I watch interviews, I do recognize that even if the guest is erudite, as a listener, I don't gain enough. Many of the questions that are posed to the guests tend to be a bit overly political and sometimes just downright stupid. So if we want to enhance civic culture, this show and other platforms are important. The interviewer must be prepared. You need to know what you're going to talk about. And I find that many of these interviewers are just politicians. So I don't get enough from interviews. I don't know about you, but that's contributing to the decline in civic culture and the intellectual state of America. The interviews are just too stupid.
Yeah, I mean, CNN hasn't called me, so I don't really have to worry about that level. But it's the kind of forums that I'm involved with are closer to what we do in academia, where we debate the efficacy, the importance, and the rigor of ideas, and the politics is something that's completely separate. We analyze politics. We don't have to engage in politics.
Yeah, so for example, I'm talking to you about Fukuzawa Yukichi, and the political person would have just engaged in a lame discussion about Eurocentrism and slavery and racism. The listeners would not have garnered anything from that interview.
Yeah, I didn't really understand that, Lipton. I apologize, but you were breaking up with that
Okay, so
last.
yeah, I'll repeat. I'm saying that we're talking about Fukuzawa Yukichi, and we're
Right.
discussing these complicated issues without being political. And I'm saying a political person would have just used the interview and as an example to argue that Fukuzawa was influenced by the West, and because of Western influence, he became an imperialism and Western society is bad. That type of sloppy debate.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm annoyed. I don't know about you, but like these guys need to up their game. I'm not impressed. It's just
Yeah.
the discourse is just too shallow.
Well, the thing is, Lipton, is what you're doing is very important then, because the thing is we can make culture and we can make politics and civic discourse, and that's what we're doing right now. So I think this is quite important. We just do what we can, right? And the newspaper men, the CNNs of the world will wag, but we need to bring it to a higher level.
Yes, so speaking to you has been a pleasure, but unfortunately I have to wrap up. But we'll definitely talk again, Professor. Bye.
Okay. All right. Take care. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.